You're listening to Procurement 6, the weekly podcast from the team at Art of Procurement that summarizes this week in procurement in just 6 short segments.
Hi there, I'm Philip Heitzen, and today is Friday, March 18th, 2022.
6.
Welcome to this week's Procurement 6. This week's Procurement 6 is proudly sponsored by Zip Intake to Procure. Zip is the world's leading intake to procure solution, one place for employees to initiate a purchase or vendor request. And we're also delighted to be partnering with Zip on a research paper on the all-important topic of employee experience during the intake to procure process. The stakeholder experience during the process often defines the perception of the role of procurement as either a bureaucratic gatekeeper or an enabler of business strategy. So tell us what you think. Does employee experience really matter to procurement? Head on over to artofprocurement.com/experience survey to give us your thoughts.
5.
Talent management is one of the hottest trends in business today. Talent has always been a key differentiator, but recent changes have been accelerated by COVID and stressed by the Great Resignation, leading us to total talent management, also known as contingent labour. So in this week's Art of Procurement podcast, I was joined by Matthias Linnemann, the co-founder and chief commercial officer of Worksum, a marketplace and workforce management system for freelance and contract labour. He and his team have had a front row seat for the recent changes in talent, and they've not just monitored trends, they've found ways to innovate the space as well. And so in the podcast, I asked Matthias, what is the burning platform for the rise in the freelance economy, which he had stated earlier in the pod, actually grew by 34% in the US in 2021.
It's both. Right now, we're in a situation where there's a massive gap between supply and demand for talent.
Yeah.
There isn't enough people around. And so it's mostly about finding talent, and then companies are typically kind of ready to pay whatever it costs because they know they have to pay for talent these days. When the economy changes and if things slow down at some point, yes, immediately variable cost will be on the agenda. Companies that will have an ability to adjust their cost base faster will have a massive advantage in such an economy. They will always have that, in my opinion, but especially in a downturn, if they have the ability to shrink their workforce down faster, of course, they will have a massive advantage.
4.
I was asked last week if I could predict the future direction of oil prices, given the rapid recent increases due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, subsequent sanctions, and the US announcing a ban on Russian oil imports. This is, of course, of particular interest to procurement, given the flow-through of oil prices into so many of the goods and services that we buy. And it is, of course, very difficult, if not impossible, to predict short-term oil prices. As in all financial markets, while pricing trends typically reflect economic conditions, the daily fluctuations in price, the peaks and the troughs, are often based on emotion and fear rather than market fundamentals. If the war continues, then I'd suggest we're in for a continued rise in oil prices over the near term for that reason. However, when we look to the medium and long term, I think about supply and demand fundamentals. In a recent New York Times podcast, Clifford Krauss, one of their energy business correspondents, made the case that fundamental supply and demand will not change, but there may be a shuffling of the deck chairs in terms of who buys from whom. As the West reduces reliance on Russia, China may step in to fill the gap. The Middle East supply that China would ordinarily buy is freed up to supply the West, along with the reduction of sanctions on Iran and Venezuela. Countries like the US will start to bring capacity back online to fill the gap. So in the midterm, things may not look as uncertain or as scary as they do now. Just one more reason to make sure that any cost increases that you do agree to are only temporary, so you can recover those increases as soon as prices normalize.
This is Procurement 6 from Art of Procurement. To get notified every time an episode is published, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe. 3.
We are being asked to speak a lot right now on how to mitigate cost increase requests, and it's something that we've also covered on Procurement 6 and the Art of Procurement podcast. Value Analysis Value Engineering, or VAVE, is a tool that I learned at the very beginning of my procurement career as a buyer of plastic components for an automotive manufacturer. In short, it's a way to break down the entire manufacturing process and the materials used to identify opportunities to reduce cost, increase process efficiencies, or find any redundancies. This is a technique that I've subsequently applied both in direct and indirect procurement, framed as follows. How can I help my supplier reduce their cost to serve me? The next time you get a cost increase request, ask them this question. Offer to bring together your team and their team into a workshop to explore these further. You may be surprised by what opportunities you find. This helps mitigate some and potentially all of that cost increase request, while giving your supplier ideas that they can use across the rest of their customer base to increase their margins, creating a customer of choice relationship for you in the process.
2.
During our AOP Digital Outcomes 2022 event last week, I had the opportunity to reconnect with Jack Freeman, partner at Peakspan Capital. While discussing the latest trends in procurement technology and investments, Jack referenced the pace of change in procurement being slower than in other industries that Peakspan Capital follows. When I asked Jack why, I was pleasantly surprised by the answer, as Jack, being an outsider, has a somewhat different perspective. It's easy for us to be hard on ourselves as procurement professionals, but Jack felt that the real reason why change is often slower in procurement is because of the complexity of our interactions and integrations across the business. Procurement and procurement technology touches all parts of the business, and accordingly requires multiple levels of buy-in and support. On the flip side, using sales and marketing as an example, the technology in those functions usually operates in a silo, in that it doesn't touch other areas of the business, and therefore it's easier to make changes and trial new solutions.
1.
On April 12th, we were joined by longtime Art of Procurement friends Joe Payne and Jennifer Ulrich from Corcentric for an AOP Live webinar session titled The 3 Problems That Will Make Your P2P Implementation Fail. I'm sure you'd love to know right now what those 3 problems are, but for that, you're going to have to visit the registration link on today's episode page or go to artofprocurement.com/calendar and check out our upcoming digital events. What I can tell you is that Joe and Jennifer have seen more procurement transformations than they'd probably like to admit, and all of the roadblocks stem from these 3 problems. The solution is a heavy dose of change management, which is always a challenge for procurement. So just go to artofprocurement.com/calendar to find out more. And of course, you can find all the links associated with stories mentioned today at the show notes page for this episode at artofprocurement.com/podcast.
Thanks for listening. We'll be back next Friday at 6 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. If you've enjoyed this pod, help us grow and tell your peers to search for Procurement 6 wherever they get their podcasts.